There's something unsettling about being truly understood. Not the shallow kind where someone guesses your favorite color or detects a tremor in your voice, but the deep kind. The kind where someone doesn't just hear your words, but notices the silence behind them. The kind where your attempts at control are seen for what they are: camouflage. Most people walk through life trying to seem unreadable, thinking mystery protects them. They wear certainty like perfume, posture like armor. But they forget. Real readers aren't fooled by surface. They're not scanning for tricks. They're watching for the moment your guard drops. And it always does. You've been read before. Not by someone skilled in strategy, but by someone quiet enough to witness the fracture beneath your facade. And maybe you didn't realize it, because no one tells you that visibility doesn't shout. It waits. It waits for your patterns to repeat, for your tone to crack, for the contradiction to show up and expose everything you thought you buried. This isn't about manipulation. This isn't about tactics. This is about the quiet science of seeing. Because once you begin to notice, not what people say, but what they flinch from, you start to see the world differently. You begin to understand. People aren't hiding to deceive you. They're hiding to survive. And survival, more often than not, wears a smile. There's a common belief people carry like a shield. I'm hard to read. It sounds like a badge of honor. Mysterious, complex, untouchable. But the truth is, complexity isn't concealment. It's exposure in a different language. And often the ones who most desperately want to remain unread are the ones who've been hurt the most when someone once understood them too well. People don't hide because they're good at it. They hide because somewhere along the way, they learned being seen costs more than being ignored. You say you're unreadable, but your timing gives you away. Your posture changes when your confidence is artificial. Your laugh arrives a fraction too late, too loud, too sharp. These aren't flaws, they're markers, the kind that people who really pay attention don't miss. Most of us mistake chaos for depth, silence for mystery, and detachment for emotional mastery. But these are just repackaged survival strategies. And survival, ironically, is what makes people predictable. Not because they are shallow, but because pain, when left unexamined, becomes routine. The illusion of unreadability isn't born from brilliance, it's born from repetition. The same responses to rejection, the same avoidance of vulnerability, the same performance of composure. Once you know what to look for, people stop being enigmas. They start becoming maps. This doesn't mean everyone is simple. It means complexity doesn't prevent recognition. It only deters the inattentive, the ones who are too distracted by performance to notice pattern. But the ones who notice, they don't need hours of conversation. They only need a moment. Because in that moment, they aren't listening for your story. They're listening for your reflex. And your reflex speaks volumes. We think words are a window into the soul. We assume that when someone speaks, they're sharing something true. But language, as Nietzsche understood, is rarely about truth. It's about safety. You speak not to reveal, but to control perception, and you do it beautifully. We all do. We learn early that certain tones get us approval. Certain stories earn us connection. Certain pauses suggest depth, even when we feel hollow. What we say is often not what we believe. It's what we hope won't get us rejected. Most people aren't lying. They're editing. You can hear it in how people soften the blow of honesty with jokes, how they pivot away from questions that land too close to the raw parts, how they over-explain, not to clarify, but to fortify their emotional walls. If you listen long enough, you'll hear that words are rarely direct. They're like fences with little gaps, just wide enough for fear to peek through. The problem isn't inauthenticity, it's that we've built entire identities on top of protection mechanisms. And when you forget that protection is the point, you mistake the mask for the person. When someone tells you they're fine, they're not deceiving you. They're reciting a line they've memorized through experience. It worked before, it kept people distant. And that distance felt safer than exposure. So they keep using it, over and over. The smart reader doesn't take words at face value. They look beneath the phrasing. Why this word? Why now? Why avoid that story? And once you start listening in that way, you stop being confused by contradiction. You start being moved by it. Because contradiction is where the truth tries, and often fails, to sneak through the cracks of performance. Truth, when it does appear, rarely comes with a spotlight. It hides in subtle mismatches. The person who insists they're not angry while their jaw is clenched. The friend who says they're over it, yet avoids every space where memories might resurface. The partner who preaches independence but panics when they feel unseen. Contradiction isn't a flaw, it's a flag. We are conditioned to trust consistency. When people say one thing and do another, we call them hypocrites. But Nietzsche would argue, this tension isn't hypocrisy, it's evidence. It shows you where belief ends and self-protection begins. Contradiction is not the opposite of truth. It's the proof that truth is fighting to exist beneath the script. Watch the body before the words. Does the person shift uncomfortably before telling you they're confident? Do their eyes wander when the subject turns personal? Does their voice go too steady when they say they don't care? These moments aren't dramatic. They're micro-confessions. And they're everywhere, all the time. But only if you're paying attention. You don't need to confront contradiction. That's not the point. The goal isn't to accuse someone of inconsistency. The goal is to understand what they're trying so hard not to admit, even to themselves. And in doing that, you stop being a participant in their performance. You become something rarer, a witness, someone who doesn't just hear what's said, but notices what was almost said and what that almost reveals. Because in the end, people don't stumble when they speak untruth. They stumble when the truth is too loud to fully suppress. Every person walks around echoing a history they rarely talk about. You can hear it in how someone answers a simple question with too much detail, in how they interrupt conversations not to be rude, but because they were never allowed to finish a thought as a child, in how they dismiss compliments quickly, as if kindness were a threat. These aren't quirks. They're reverberations, emotional fingerprints left by a younger version of them still trying to feel safe. Most people believe they've moved on from the past. They think healing is about forgetting. But the psyche doesn't operate on deletion. It operates on rehearsal. The body remembers patterns even when the mind forgets the origin. That's why someone avoids silence. They once associated it with abandonment. That's why another clings to control. Chaos used to mean danger. You're not just watching a person's present. You're watching the aftershock of their former selves. You'll notice it if you sit in stillness long enough. The way someone's mood shifts when plans change, how their posture stiffens at the mention of disappointment, how they overcompensate with humor, not because they're funny, but because making others laugh became their only ticket to affection. Behavior is the echo. Pain is the voice, but most people only notice the volume, never the source. They react to the reaction without understanding the story underneath. Here's the strange mercy of all this. People repeat because repetition once gave them a sense of control. Even if the pattern is destructive, it's familiar. And familiarity, to a wounded nervous system, feels safer than the unknown. So when someone pushes you away before you get too close, don't assume they don't want connection. It may be that every time they got close, they were punished for it. So they built a firewall from ritual. Deflect, distance, defend. Reading people, then, is not about decoding words or even behaviors. It's about recognizing which emotions are old ghosts. When you understand that someone is reacting from memory, not malice, you don't get pulled into their storm. You begin to see the child inside the armor. And that shift, it changes everything. You stop asking, why are they like this? You start asking, what pain taught them this was safer? That's not weakness, that's vision. And it's how understanding begins. There's a common assumption that people who present an image are being fake. That if someone appears composed, spiritual, strong, they must be hiding something. And while that may be true, it's not the kind of deception we think it is. A mask isn't a lie, it's a memory. It's the shape a person had to become when their original shape was punished, ignored, or misunderstood. The mask didn't come from malice, it came from necessity, from learning, slowly and painfully, which parts of themselves were safe to show, and which parts had to disappear to be accepted. So when someone seems too perfect, too polished, too put together, look closer, not with judgment, with reverence. Because what you're seeing is the final draft of a person edited by years of rejection. The performer didn't wake up one day and decide to be inauthentic. They just realized early on that their authenticity didn't fit the environment they were in. So they made adjustments. And those adjustments became identity. This is what most people miss. The mask is the personality because it had to be. Not because the real self died, but because the real self wasn't safe. So it went underground. And yet, the truth doesn't stay buried. It shows up in micro moments. The hesitation before a vulnerable admission. The quiet flinch when someone gets too kind. The overreaction to a mild critique. These aren't signs of fraud. They're signals from a deeper layer, whispering, I still exist. I just haven't been welcomed in a long time. The irony is this. The deeper the soul, the more convincing the mask. Because the stakes were higher, because the hurt was deeper, because the raw material of that person was so vivid, so bright, that it scared the people around them. And brightness, when misunderstood, gets dimmed before it gets celebrated. So they learned, they dimmed, they adjusted, they survived. You don't break someone's mask by calling it out. You don't shame it into disappearing. You hold space for the moment it slips, and instead of reacting, you remain. Quiet, present, safe. Because only in safety do people unmask. Reading people, then, isn't about seeing through them. It's about seeing to them, to the part they forgot how to access, to the piece that's been waiting for permission to breathe. And the moment you stop trying to fix the mask or fear it, you finally begin to understand. The real person was never gone, just hidden. Not by choice, by memory. There's a quiet shift that happens when you begin to read people deeply, not from a place of suspicion, but from stillness. You notice the twitch before the smile, the delay before a confession, the way someone's certainty feels too clean, but something else happens too, something inward. You begin to recognize yourself, not the self you present, but the self you've avoided, the one who laughs too hard at silence, who changes the subject when things get intimate, who overachieves, not from drive, but from dread. You begin to see that the same micro-signals you observe in others live inside you too. You've just become so skilled at performing that you forgot you were acting. You can't read people honestly without seeing your own patterns reflected back. And that's what makes it so uncomfortable, because the more clearly you observe others, the harder it becomes to lie to yourself. You notice your justifications for distance. You notice how quickly you explain away your emotions with logic. You notice how often your strength is just well-rehearsed detachment. Every insight becomes a mirror. That's why this work isn't glamorous. Real awareness doesn't come with applause. It comes with grief. Grief for all the years you were performing connection instead of feeling it. Grief for how often you mistook fear for wisdom. How many times you convinced yourself you didn't care, simply because it hurt less to pretend. And the truth is, some of the hardest people to read are the ones who think they've done the most healing, because they've buried their chaos under narratives, turned vulnerability into content, memorized spiritual language as a new armor. But the mask doesn't disappear when you become self-aware, it just gets cleverer. So the next level of clarity is this: turning your gaze inward. Can you observe your own avoidance without dressing it up as independence? Can you sit in your own emotional dissonance without rushing to analyze it? Can you name your patterns without needing to defend them? Because once you do, the way you read others softens. You stop needing to decode them as puzzles. You start recognizing them as fellow survivors. You stop assuming people are trying to hurt you. You start seeing they're trying not to drown. The same tells you catch in their tone. You've used them too. The same avoidance they show. It's written in your own history. And in that moment, you don't just become perceptive. You become human again. We often think insight is sharp, that to see through someone is to pierce them. But Nietzsche understood what many forget. The deepest vision is never cruel. It's gentle. It doesn't shatter illusions. It invites them to rest. Clarity, when mature, isn't about control. It's about compassion. Not the sugary kind that avoids confrontation, but the fierce kind. The kind that looks at someone's armor and sees the wound it's protecting. The kind that doesn't flinch when a person lashes out because it sees the fear beneath the noise. To see someone clearly is not to diagnose them. It is to bear witness without needing to fix or name. It is to stand in their contradiction and not recoil. To hear their silence and not rush to fill it. To let them be exactly what they are, even if what they are is fragmented. Because once you begin to see this way, you lose your appetite for judgment. Not because you've become passive, but because you've become aware of how tender people really are, even the harsh ones, especially the harsh ones. That anger, it's how they stayed standing. That arrogance, it's how they made themselves matter. That coldness, it's how they kept from falling apart. You learn to stop taking things personally, not because you don't feel, but because you know that most things said in haste are echoes, not attacks. Echoes of fear, echoes of not being enough, echoes of needing to be noticed but not knowing how to ask. And once you see that, you change, not by force but by proximity to truth. You become the quiet in the room that allows someone's mask to slip safely. You become the presence that doesn't require performance. You become the witness that doesn't punish the fracture, but honors the strength it took to keep going despite it. That's what it means to read someone, not to conquer them, but to meet them where they haven't yet dared to meet themselves. And if you can do that, not once, but consistently, you stop fearing rejection. You stop chasing validation. You stop mistaking the noise for the signal, because now you know. The loudest person in the room is usually the most afraid. The coldest is the most exhausted. The most confident, often the most fragile. And the most sincere moment you'll ever witness in someone else is the moment they forget to protect themselves. That moment is not weakness. It is the soul, unfiltered. It is truth, finally allowed to breathe. Reading people has never been about power. It's been about clarity. Not the kind that lets you win arguments or predict behavior, but the kind that lets you stop taking things so personally. Because once you learn how much of what people do is built from their own bruises, their own histories, you begin to loosen your grip on offense, on resentment, on the need to defend yourself. The angry outburst. That's not always aggression. It's often panic in disguise. The withdrawn friend. Maybe they weren't avoiding you. Maybe they were afraid they'd be too much if they stayed. We forget that everyone we meet has lived 1,000 silent lives before we said hello. And in those lives, they built walls. Those walls aren't proof of cruelty. They're the residue of disappointment. And if you learn to see them, not just the cracks, but the structure, you stop reacting to the surface and start recognizing the blueprint. This isn't softness, it's vision. It's what happens when perception matures into compassion. You begin to hear the subtext in a compliment, the grief in a joke, the vulnerability hidden behind criticism. And in that moment, when you choose to understand rather than resist, you free yourself. Because the people who once felt like puzzles now appear as mirrors. Not perfect, not pure, but human, just like you.